She was 8 months pregnant, running down a hospital hallway to save a life, when his hand connected with her face. The sound echoed through the entire ward. Everyone froze. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Not one person stepped forward. He straightened his jacket, looked down at her with cold, empty eyes, and said the 5 words that would cost him everything. "Do you know my father?" What he didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the woman trembling on that floor wasn't just a nurse. She was a sister. And her brother didn't carry a briefcase. He didn't sit behind a desk. He didn't make phone calls in boardrooms or send strongly worded letters. He made problems disappear. The kind of problems that never came back. Powerful men had once begged on their knees just to stay in the same city as him. Cartels had sent representatives not to threaten him, but to calm him down. His name alone was enough to clear a room. And right now, that man's little sister was sitting on a cold hospital floor, one hand over her swollen belly, tears running silently down her face. She had promised herself she would never call him. She had promised herself she could keep her 2 worlds apart, the world of white coats and bedside prayers, and the world her brother lived in, where debts were settled in silence and darkness. But promises have a way of breaking when someone hurts what you love. She picked up her phone with shaking hands. She couldn't even speak when he answered. All she managed was 4 words, barely a whisper. "At work today, Wick." And that was enough. Ella had the kind of heart that made people feel safe just by being near her. She was the nurse who remembered your name the second time you visited. The one who squeezed your hand before a painful procedure and stayed a moment longer than she had to, just so you wouldn't feel alone. Her patients didn't just heal in her care, they felt seen. She carried their fear so they didn't have to carry it all by themselves. Nobody at the hospital knew her full story. That was the way she wanted it. She had grown up in the same broken streets as her older brother, watched the same hard world shape them both, only it shaped them differently. Ella ran toward the light. She studied harder than anyone around her believed she could, worked double shifts to pay for her nursing degree, and built a life that smelled like antiseptic and purpose. Her brother ran the other direction. Not because he was weak. Because someone had to protect her while she ran. Wick never talked about what he did. And Ella never asked. What she knew was this: when she was 18 and 3 men followed her home from the market, they were never seen in that neighborhood again. When a landlord threatened to throw her out during her final semester, the landlord quietly changed his mind the next morning. Nobody explained these things. Nobody had to. Some people are born to build. Some people are born to guard what others build. Wick was the second kind. But Ella had made herself a promise the day she got her nursing badge. She pinned it to her chest and whispered it like a prayer: "This life is mine. Clean hands, clean world." She would handle her own battles. She would not drag her brother's darkness into the life she had carefully, painfully built in the light. She kept that promise for 6 years. She was keeping it on the very morning everything changed. It was supposed to be an ordinary shift. Busy, yes, the hospital was always busy, but ordinary. She had come in early, as she always did, taken her rounds, checked on her patients, and was moving quickly down the main corridor when the call came through. A doctor needed assistance immediately. A real emergency. The kind where every second that passed meant something irreversible. She was already moving when they walked in. If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button before you keep watching. Now, let's continue. The emergency room doors burst open and the stretcher came flying through, wheels screaming against the polished floor. The paramedics were already calling out numbers, blood pressure dropping, pulse weakening, and Ella had her tray of supplies in both hands before they finished the sentence. She had done this 100 times. She knew the rhythm of a crisis the way most people knew the rhythm of a song. Her feet moved fast, her scrubs brushing the wall as she turned the corner, her mind already 3 steps ahead. That was when he stepped directly into her path. He was tall and well-dressed, wearing a watch that cost more than her monthly salary, his collar open just enough to say he did not have to try. His girlfriend stood slightly behind him, holding up one finger like it deserved a spotlight. A paper cut. A thin, barely there a line of red on her index finger that had stopped bleeding on its own. Ella stopped. She took one breath. She spoke as kindly and evenly as she could manage, because she always did, even on days like this one. She told them that reception was just down the hall, that someone would help them right away, and that she had a critical patient who needed her immediately. She smiled. She meant it. She turned to leave. The slap came so hard her vision flashed white. The sound cracked through the corridor like a gunshot and the hospital stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. The nurses who had been rushing froze mid-step. The doctors who had been talking went silent. The whole busy, never-stopping world of that emergency floor held its breath as one. Ella's hand flew to her cheek, and she felt the heat blooming immediately under her palm, a sharp and spreading burn that moved all the way up to her eye. She turned back slowly. He was still standing there with his hand slightly raised, his chin lifted, and his eyes full of the kind of cold satisfaction that only comes from someone who has never once faced a real consequence. He looked around at the people watching, making sure they were all paying attention, and then he asked his question loudly. He wanted to know if she had any idea who his father was. He let the words sit there in the silence, enjoying them. Ella said nothing. She stood with one hand pressed to her burning cheek and the other resting gently over her swollen belly. Around her, not a single person stepped forward. Not one voice rose up in that corridor she had spent 3 years giving everything to. But in that silence, something moved through her. Cold and quiet and completely certain. He was asking the wrong question. He wanted to know if she knew who his father was. What he did not know, what he could not possibly know, was that the more important question was whether he had any idea who her brother was. He had just hit the wrong woman. The silence lasted only a few seconds before the sound of quick footsteps came around the corner. Ella turned, and for one brief moment she felt something loosen in her chest. Someone was coming. Someone with authority, someone who had seen or heard what happened, someone who was going to make this right. Dr. Harmon appeared with his hands already out in front of him, palms open, his face arranged into an expression of deep concern. But he walked straight past Ella without slowing down. He did not look at her cheek. He did not ask if she was all right. He walked directly toward the young man and his girlfriend and began speaking in a voice so smooth and low it barely carried down the corridor. Ella watched him bow slightly. She watched him use the word sir. She watched him tell the young man there had been a misunderstanding, that the hospital was deeply sorry for any inconvenience, and that his girlfriend would be taken to a private room immediately for proper care. He said it all with a calm and practiced ease, like a man who had done this kind of thing before, because he had. Then he turned to Ella. The warmth left his face completely. What replaced it was not anger. It was something colder than anger. It was indifference. He told her in a flat, quiet voice to collect her things and take the rest of the day. He said it the way you would tell someone to clear their desk. Like the matter was already closed. Like she was already gone. Ella opened her mouth. She wanted to explain about the patient who had come through those doors fighting for his life. She wanted to describe what had happened, the sequence of it, clearly and calmly, because she knew she had done nothing wrong and she believed, for one more second, that it still mattered. But Dr. Harmon had already looked away. His back was to her. He was guiding the Harrington boy down the hallway with one hand, speaking to him in a low and reassuring tone. Around Ella, the nurses looked at the floor. The doctors found reasons to turn away. The corridor that had been frozen in shock 30 seconds ago suddenly found its movement again, everyone returning to their work, everyone choosing not to see. 3 years. Ella had given this hospital 3 years of double shifts, skipped lunches, late evenings, and every bit of herself she had to give. She had worked through the early months of her pregnancy without complaint. She had stayed when she was exhausted and shown up when she was scared and done it all with a quiet dedication that she had been proud of. It had meant nothing. Not against the right last name. Not against the right bank account. She picked up her bag with steady hands. She kept her face still. She walked to the locker room alone, changed out of her scrubs, and stepped out into the cold evening with her dignity in pieces and nowhere left to put them. The cold met her the second the hospital doors closed behind her. It was the kind of evening that had no softness in it, gray from the ground up, with a damp wind that moved straight through her jacket like it was not there. She stood on the pavement for a moment, blinking against the light, feeling slightly unreal, the way you do when something bad happens so fast your body has not caught up with it yet. She drove home without remembering the drive. She sat in the car outside the apartment building for a few minutes without getting out. Then she went inside, took the lift up in silence, and stood in front of her own front door for a long moment before she could bring herself to open it. The apartment was dark. She had known it would be. Marcus had left for his work trip 2 days ago and would not be back until the weekend. She had been fine with that this morning. This morning felt like a long time ago. She turned on one lamp and sat down on the couch slowly, making room for herself the way she always had to now, shifting and settling until she found a position that was almost comfortable. She rested both hands over her belly and let out a long and shaking breath. Then, quietly, the tears started. They were not dramatic. There was no sobbing, no gasping, no outburst. Just a slow and steady stream that she could not stop once it started, tracking silently down both cheeks while she sat in the half-dark and replayed the afternoon over and over. The sound of the slap. The heat in her cheek. His expression after, satisfied and unconcerned. Dr. Harmon's back as he walked away. The floor of the corridor, which was all she had seen from everyone else. Her locker being emptied into a bag while the sound of the hospital carried on around her like she had never been part of it at all. She thought about the baby. She thought about the stress her body had taken today, about the tightness she had felt across her middle since she got in the car, and she pressed her hands more firmly against herself as if she could hold everything steady through sheer will. The room grew darker as the evening moved along. She did not get up to eat. She did not turn on the television. She sat with the silence and the shadow and the kind of loneliness that does not come from being alone in a room. It comes from feeling like no one in the world is standing beside you. She stayed like that for a long time. Then she reached across the cushion and picked up her phone. There was a number saved without a name. No label. No history of messages. Just a sequence of digits sitting quietly in her contacts like a sealed letter she had promised herself would stay sealed unless the world gave her no other choice. She had made that promise years ago, sitting in Wick's kitchen while he told her, plainly and without dressing it up, what his life actually looked like. He had not asked her to approve of it. He had not asked her to pretend. He only asked her to stay his sister, and she had, and the agreement between them had been wordless, but completely understood. Her world stayed her world. His stayed his. She would never reach across that line unless something truly broke. Her thumb hovered over the number. She thought about the way her cheek had felt when it connected with his palm. She thought about standing there with her hand pressed against her face and her baby pressing against her ribs, and not a single person willing to look at her directly. She thought about Dr. Harmon's voice, flat and dismissive, telling her to leave as though she were the one who had done something wrong. She thought about her child. She thought about what she was teaching this baby, even now, before it had taken its first breath, about whether the world was a place where people who hurt you walked away clean every time. She pressed call. It rang once. Just once. His voice came through the way it always did, quiet and even and completely without urgency, the voice of a man who had learned a long time ago that calm was its own kind of power. She opened her mouth to speak. Nothing came out. The tears that had been slow and silent all evening suddenly rose into something else entirely, something that filled her throat and pressed behind her eyes and made it impossible to form a single word. She tried again. She breathed in. She tried one more time and pushed through everything that was sitting on top of the words and managed 3 of them before her voice gave out completely. At work today. The line went dead. Ella lowered the phone and pressed it against her chest. She sat in the dark of her living room and breathed, in and out, slowly, one hand on her belly, the other still holding the phone. She did not know exactly what would happen next. She did not need to. She had grown up with Wick. She had watched him her whole life. She knew the particular quality of that silence on the other end before he ended the call. It was not the silence of someone deciding what to do. It was the silence of someone who had already decided and was simply beginning. Wick set the phone down on the table and was still for exactly 3 seconds. The men in the room with him noticed. They always did. It was one of those things you learned quickly when you worked for him, that stillness meant something. In a room full of men who dealt in pressure and silence, his particular stillness had a different quality to it entirely. It did not feel like nothing happening. It felt like everything happening at once, below the surface, where you could not see it. He did not call Ella back. He did not ask questions. 3 words were enough. She had called him, the one call she had sworn she would never make unless everything else had failed, and she had been crying so hard she could not finish a sentence. The details could come later. Right now he needed the shape of it. He stood up and made 2 calls in under 5 minutes. By the time the city's evening traffic was beginning to thin out, 3 of his most careful and trusted people were already moving through different parts of the city. Each of them carried a specific question, and each of them had the kind of quiet authority that made people answer those questions quickly and without leaving anything out. The name of the hospital came back before the hour was finished. The young man's name followed shortly after. By the time Wick had filled and drunk a glass of water and stood looking out the window at the lights spreading out across the city, he had a complete picture. The family name, the businesses, the properties, the board connections and the political donations and the names of every lawyer and fixer they had ever put on retainer. The 3 previous incidents that had been paid for and buried. The pattern of a family that had been protected so many times they had forgotten protection was even happening. He stood at the window for a long time after that. He had spent years building a wall between Ella and all of this. He had done it carefully and deliberately because she was the one truly good thing that had come out of the life they had both started from, and he had not wanted any part of his shadow to fall across her. She had a career and a home and a man who loved her and a baby coming, and Wick had stood back and kept his distance and let her have all of that without him dragging his world through the door behind him. But she had called. And somewhere in the city, in one of those expensive homes lit up against the dark, a young man who had spent his entire life believing that money was a kind of armor was sleeping without the faintest idea that his protection had already been removed. The shadow was awake. And it was patient. The knock came early enough that the morning light was still pale and thin against the windows. 3 taps. Not hard. Not rushed. Measured, the way a metronome is measured, each one placed with exact and deliberate intention. Mr. Harrington had answered the door himself because his household staff did not start until 8, and he had been up early, going over documents at the kitchen table, the way he did most mornings. He was a large man who moved through the world with the ease of someone who had never been made to wait for anything. He pulled the door open with mild annoyance already written across his face. The man on his front step was not what he was expecting. He was not loud. He was not threatening in any visible way. He was simply standing there in plain, neat clothing, holding a sealed envelope, and wearing the specific kind of calm that does not come from not knowing things, but from knowing far too many of them. He introduced himself with a single name, handed over the envelope with a polite and unhurried nod, and said nothing else. Inside the envelope were photographs. Security footage stills, sharp and clear. Ella in the corridor with her hand against her face. The young man's arm raised. Dr. Harmon walking past her without stopping. Then a second layer of papers beneath the photographs, a detailed and quietly written document that covered the Harrington family's businesses one by one, their property holdings, their offshore accounts, their board memberships and silent partnerships, and the names of every person who had helped make the 3 previous incidents disappear. At the bottom of the final page, there was no threat. No ultimatum written in aggressive language. Just a time, a date, a location, and one sentence that said, "Come alone." Mr. Harrington looked up from the papers. The man was already halfway down the front path, hands in his pockets, completely unhurried, like he had only come to deliver something and the rest was simply not his concern. That evening, Harrington made 17 calls. His lawyers. His political contacts. The two men he had always called when things needed to be made quiet. Every number rang or connected, but the moment he said the name written at the top of that document, something changed in every voice on the other end. Conversations shortened. Excuses were made. Callbacks were promised and did not come. He sat in his study late into the night with all his lights on and the document spread across his desk and felt something he genuinely did not have a name for. He had sat in rooms where powerful men tried to pressure him, and he had not felt it then. He had faced legal challenges and hostile takeover attempts and not felt it then either. This was different. This was the feeling of a door closing, quietly, from the outside. Ella had not planned on fighting. Not because she did not want to, but because she had been alone in that corridor, and she had no idea who else had seen, or who would be willing to say so, or whether any of it would matter in the end against the weight of everything the Harrington name could throw at a case. So when the call came on Thursday morning from a lawyer she had never spoken to before, she had gone very still and listened carefully. The woman on the other end spoke with a clear and measured confidence. She said a case had been filed on Ella's behalf. She said Ella did not need to gather anything or prepare any statements. Everything, she said, was already in place. All Ella needed to do was show up. The courtroom was small and wood-paneled, the kind of room that felt older than it looked. Ella sat at the front with Marcus beside her, his hand folded over hers. He had come back early from his trip the moment she told him, no questions asked, bags left half-packed. Across the aisle, the Harrington family had arrived with 4 lawyers in matching suits and the general attitude of people who considered a courtroom a minor inconvenience. The young man sat between his team looking bored. He leaned back slightly. He checked his phone before it was taken. He had done this before, been called into rooms, sat through processes, watched lawyers turn everything into nothing. It was expensive and tedious, but it always ended the same way. The judge called the room to order and Ella's legal team began. First came the security footage. Every angle clearly time-stamped. The corridor. The moment of impact. The immediate aftermath. Then came 14 written statements from hospital staff, nurses and doctors, and one orderly who had all come forward in the days since the incident, quietly and separately, each one describing exactly what they had seen. Then came Ella's medical records, documenting the injury to her face and the elevated stress markers that had required monitoring for the safety of her pregnancy. Then came the second filing. It was attached to the first as a supplementary document, and it detailed 3 prior incidents involving the same individual, each one settled privately, each one involving a non-disclosure agreement that had been signed under significant financial pressure. The filing included the names of the original complainants, 2 of whom had submitted new statements voluntarily. The Harrington lawyers moved for a postponement. Denied. They moved for a recess. Denied. They moved to have the supplementary filing excluded on procedural grounds. Denied, with the judge noting that the procedural argument had been anticipated and addressed before the hearing was opened. The young man's expression had changed. The boredom was gone. In its place was something younger and much less certain, the face of someone finally understanding, too late, that this room was not going to work the way all the other rooms had worked. The number came out of the judge's mouth and settled into the courtroom like something with physical weight. $1 million in compensatory and punitive damages. Mandatory conduct and awareness training to be completed within 60 days. A formal written apology, signed personally, to be delivered to the hospital board and read aloud to the full nursing staff at a time of Ella's choosing. The Harrington lawyers were already rising before she finished speaking. The lead attorney began a sentence that had the shape of an objection, but the judge raised one hand, and he stopped mid-word and sat back down. She spoke for 2 minutes without referring to any notes. She spoke about the particular responsibility that comes with extraordinary privilege, and how the absence of consequence over time does not mean the absence of wrongdoing, only the absence of accountability. She spoke about the courage it requires for a pregnant woman who was publicly humiliated and then abandoned by her own institution to choose to stand up in a courtroom anyway. She spoke about what it costs a society when wealth is treated as a substitute for basic decency, and when powerful families are allowed to pay their way clear of every rule that applies to everyone else. Then she closed her file and rose and left, and that was entirely that. In the corridor outside, Marcus held Ella for a long time. She stood with her face pressed against his shoulder and let him hold her weight for a little while, because she was tired in a way that went deeper than the day, deeper than the week, all the way down to the months of carrying everything quietly without letting it show. She was not thinking about the money. The money was not the point, had never been the point. She was thinking about the 14 people who had come forward. She was thinking about each of them sitting down and writing out what they had seen on a form that had their name on it, when they could have kept looking at the floor the way they had done in that corridor. She was thinking about what it had cost each of them to do that, and what it meant. She felt the baby move. A slow and certain shift, a roll of small weight from one side to the other, and she pulled back from Marcus and pressed one hand against it and laughed, a short and startled sound, surprised by it in the middle of everything else. He looked at her. She showed him where to put his hand, and he felt it, and his face changed completely, softened down to something open and young. Around them the courthouse corridor moved and murmured, people passing with their folders and their concerns, the ordinary noise of a building where difficult things were resolved every day. And standing in the middle of it, Ella breathed out slowly and felt, for the first time in over a week, like the ground was steady under her feet. She did not yet know that it was not over. Not for the Harrington family. Not even close. It did not happen all at once, because that was not how Wick worked. He was not a man who made loud moves. He was a man who understood that the most permanent kind of damage was the kind that looked, for a while, like coincidence. It began with small things. A business partner who had been with the Harrington Group for 11 years quietly initiated a review of their joint holdings and then, following the review, just as quietly withdrew. A government contract that had been in the final stages of approval was referred to a secondary committee for additional scrutiny, and the secondary committee found reasons to take its time. A bank flagged 2 accounts for what was described as a routine compliance audit, and the audit expanded in scope and did not seem to be moving toward a resolution. A property deal worth $40 million, 2 signatures away from closing, simply stopped. The other party became unavailable. Emails went unanswered. The lawyers on both sides had nothing useful to report. Each event, by itself, could be explained. People withdrew from deals. Audits happened. Timing was sometimes bad. But all of it together, arriving in a quiet wave over 3 weeks, told a different story to anyone paying close enough attention. Mr. Harrington was paying close attention. He had been paying close attention since the morning that envelope arrived at his door. He made calls. He went in person to meetings that he would normally have sent staff to. He used the particular combination of charm and implied threat that had served him well for 30 years in business and watched, with growing unease, as it produced almost nothing. People were polite. People were apologetic. But the doors stayed closed. He called the number from the letter one final time. It connected immediately, which surprised him. The voice was the same as before. There was no satisfaction in it, no cruelty, no trace of victory. It simply told him, in a calm and even tone, that all outstanding accounts had been settled and that no further action was anticipated as long as no further actions were taken. Then the call ended. Ella never asked. Wick never told. That was the shape of them, had always been the shape of them, 2 people who loved each other completely across a distance that kept them both safe. She was sitting in the same spot on the same couch on a quiet Sunday evening 3 weeks later when the baby kicked so hard she gasped. Not a flutter, not a shift, but a real and definite kick, the kind that said, "I am here and I am strong and I am coming," and Ella pressed both hands flat against herself and started laughing and crying at the same time, which was the most honest thing she had felt in weeks. Outside her window the city went on. Lights in other people's windows. The low sound of traffic below. The ordinary, unhurried sound of a life that was safe. She had kept her worlds apart her whole adult life. She had never wanted them to touch. But somewhere in the shadow of the city, her brother was already invisible again, already gone back to wherever he lived in the space between things, and she understood without needing to be told that she was the reason he had never stopped watching. Some people have security guards. Some people have lawyers. Ella had something no amount of money could buy. And the man who had raised his hand against her had just learned that at a cost that would take years to fully calculate. And that's a wrap on today's story. If this one pulled at something in your chest, if you held your breath at the hospital, if you smiled at that court, then let us know in the comments. Tell us your favorite moment and where you're watching from. And if you're new here, welcome. Subscribe so you never miss a story. Like this video so more people find it. We'll see you in the next one. Please support by subscribing and commenting what you enjoyed about the story and where you're watching from.